Pastor Trish, it is Tuesday, September 8th, and feels like it's been a long time, and it has. My apologies. I had planned on doing a devotion last evening, but I completely forgot. And it was about 7:30 at night when I finally remembered that it was Monday and not Sunday. And today is Tuesday, not Monday, right? At any rate, I will join you tonight and to get three in this week. I'm hoping to do one tomorrow and again on Thursday evening. I want to start tonight. We are on Psalm 68, and I want to start with a little poem that talks about at least a verse in this psalm, and it is from a book called Thoughts to Make Your Heart Sing by Sally Lloyd Jones. God's title. When someone important is being introduced, the announcer usually says, Mr. So and so, founder of this extra important company, or Miss Something Else, Nobel Prize winning inventor of this brilliant thing. Do you know how God likes to be introduced? And the verse is from Psalm 68. His name is the Lord, Father to the fatherless, defender of widows. Our Almighty God, who sifted stars through his fingers, stands not with kings and princes, but with the weak, the powerless, the poor. Because the people no one else thinks are important have a special place in God's heart. He hears their cries, he fights for them and defends them. And one night, long ago in Bethlehem, he stepped out of heaven and became one of them. This psalm, Psalm 68, is a fairly long psalm. And it is a psalm that has a theme of God as the divine warrior of Israel. And so there is a lot of military and warlike imagery in it, which is typical of particularly of the ancient world, of ancient Israel, that they would use that kind of imagery on a fairly common basis. But in addition to that, there's also an association of God's justice and support for the least of these in our society. And so it's almost a juxtaposition, perhaps, of two different images that we hold with a warrior image, defeating the strong, the mighty, winning the battle, but God being on the side of the least of these in society. There's much in this psalm that, simply put, is difficult to understand. There's a lot of translation difficulties with this psalm, knowing if it's how much is what the psalmist intended. Um, but still, that understanding of God being on the side of the poor and the weak comes through. And I'm just going to read a portion of this psalm. I'll start with the beginning. And the psalmist says, Let God rise up. Let his enemies scatter. Let those who hate him run scared before him. Like smoke is driven away, drive them away. Like wax melting before fire, let the wicked perish before God. But let the righteous be glad and celebrate before God. Let them rejoice with gladness. Sing to God, sing praises to his name. Exalt the one who rides the clouds. The Lord is his name. Celebrate before him. Father of orphans and defender of widows is God in his holy habitation. God settles the lonely in their homes. He sets prisoners free with happiness, but the rebellious dwell in a parched land. It will go on there as well, but again, you hear that verse that was talked about in the saying or in that poem that I read to you at first. God as father of orphans and defender of widows. It goes on and talks about kind of the God with the military figures and those kinds of things. But I want to read to you again, starting at verse 24, where it talks about the procession again of God as victor, as our warrior God defeating the enemy. They saw your procession, God, the procession of my God, my King, into the sanctuary. First came the singers, then the musicians. Between them, the young women were playing hand drums. Bless God in the great congregation. Bless the Lord from Israel's fountain. There's Benjamin leading them, though he's little. Then the princes of Judah, their speaker. Then the princes of Zebulun and the princes of Naphtali. It goes on again. And then finally, we end yet with more praise. Sing to God, all kingdoms of the earth, sing praises to my Lord. Sing to the one who rides through heaven, the most ancient heaven. Look, God sends forth his voice, his mighty voice. Recognize how strong God is. His majesty extends over Israel. His strength is in the clouds. You are awesome, God, in your sanctuaries, the God of Israel, who gives strength and power to his people. Bless God. Lots of praise, lots of celebration. I wanted you to hear that part too, though, about the procession, because hidden in there, or perhaps hidden for some of us at least, is again God's preference for the poor, for the weak, the littlest. Benjamin is one of the 12 tribes of Israel and was often considered the least of the 12 tribes, the weakest of the 12 tribes, the littlest is what the Bible passage says. And yet, in the procession, God's procession, that tribe goes first. And so, again, it's that understanding of um, God's preference for the poor. The other piece of this, when you read the rest of the psalm and read through the whole psalm, and you perhaps will struggle with some of the imagery and some of the violence that's portrayed in this, the war, the military imagery. But I would invite you to think about how we look at that imagery today, right? And how we still continue to use that and where we use it and when we use it. We talk about doing battle in all sorts of ways and places. So just offer that up as something to ponder. And finally, one more thing about this psalm that I wanted you to be aware of that I came across that I thought was interesting was this psalm, with its deference really to the powerless, holds a special place in the African American church tradition. And I just wanted to read you a little bit about that. Cheryl Townsend Gilkes talks about this, and she writes the believing communities of Africans in the United States selected, repeated, and popularized among themselves Psalm 68 as well as other texts that their oppressors neglected or discarded. The Afrocentric biblical tradition extended the life of these texts. The church came to understand verse 31 as including them specifically. I actually didn't do that verse, but it talks about mentioning Egypt and Ethiopia. And so they saw that as specifically mentioning their tradition, their ethnicity. And they were part of the tradition that had been excluded from by race, slavery, and racism. A second line of this psalm in verse 5 that you did hear, again, I want to come back to that, the father to the fatherless. The African American tradition made it not a father to the orphans, but a father to the fatherless and mother to the motherless. And I love that line. A father to the fatherless. God was the father, is the father to the fatherless, and mother to the motherless. This has become, again, in the African American tradition, a well known way of describing God in those communities. For it connects a personal God who cares about the individual's circumstances with a powerful, liberating God. And again, I think that's a great way to understand this God as a personal, connected God who cares about each one of us and at the same time liberates all of us really from sin, right? We are all liberated from sin and death and the power of the devil. And in particular, or specifically, those of us who are considered the least in society, those who are the least powerful, those who are powerless, who are orphaned, who are left defenseless, are given prioritization or are given special consideration in God's might and strength. Okay, that's 68, Psalm 68. Thank you for joining me this evening, and I will be back hopefully tomorrow night. We'll see you then.